everybody. It's wonderful to have you here for our Stop the Hate Week panel, focusing on the experiences of the Native American and Indigenous community. I'm so happy to be joined today by our SAG-AFTRA Executive Vice President, Rebecca Damon. Hello, Rebecca.
Hey,
I would also want to start with a land acknowledgement. Now, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous people as traditional stewards of this land. An acknowledgement for the land that we are on, wherever you are, we are here in gratitude. I am speaking to you from Los Angeles, where the SAG-AFTRA offices are located, and what are the lands of the Gabriel Niño Tongva and their neighbors, the Tataviam. I think it's important to point this out because Native American and Indigenous peoples are still here, and we should know who was here first and whose land you are on, and the fact that they are still thriving and surviving. I would also like to acknowledge that since we are using Zoom, a platform that is headquartered in what is now called San Jose, California, which is on the traditional lands of the Ohlone and the Tamian peoples. As our friends at Groundwater Arts remind us, the work we create together on a digital platform does not exist in an ether, in an imaginary void. It is made possible because of the physical land and the Indigenous people who steward it. Native people have been consistently misrepresented in Hollywood for many decades, creating a cycle where negative portrayals impact society's view of them, which in turn impacts the type of roles that are offered to performers who are Native people. We are honored to have two dazzling leaders from the Native American Indigenous community with us. We have Princess Daazrhaii Johnson. She has served on SAG-AFTRA's Native American Committee since 2007 and also serves on the board of Dancing with the Spirit, a program that promotes spiritual wellness through music. And Crystal Echo-Hawk, the president and CEO of IllumiNative, which she founded along with a group of respected Native artists, thought leaders, and allies to build upon the findings of Reclaiming Native Truth, RNT, the largest public opinion research and strategy setting initiative ever conducted for and about Native Americans. Princess and Crystal, welcome. I'm so happy to be with you.
Gabrielle Masik Cho, thank you so much for that warm welcome and that land acknowledgement. I have to say it always gets me emotional when I hear that, because that is something that has come about more recently. And I certainly didn't grow up hearing that. So Masik Cho, I am now going to introduce myself in my own Gwich'in language. Shalaknai, Shojri Daazrhaii Oji, Netsai Gwich'in Ithi, Shiahanai Catherine, Sa Stephen Peter Oji Gavakwa, Sa Shijunai Katsaya, Sa Aldzak, Shiji Driftin, Shoji Sho Ithi. My name is Princess Daazrhaii Johnson, and I told you who my grandparents are, the late Catherine and Stephen Peter from Arctic Village, Alaska. I am a mother of Katsaya and Aldzak and Delnor, and it's important for me to speak my native language into these spaces because part of what we are doing is reclaiming who we are as Indigenous people. And I'm especially honored to be here today with Crystal. And Crystal, I'm going to open the space up for you to introduce yourself how you would like.
Thank you so much. And I'm so grateful to be invited into this circle today. And, my name is Crystal Echo-Hawk, and I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. My Pawnee name is Skihatu Hatora, which means lights in the room woman. And I'm coming to you today from the reservation of the Muskogee Creek Nation, which is also known as downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it's just a real honor to be here today for this really important conversation.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why IllumiNatives even came about, and really, from my perspective and what I've seen in a very short amount of time, is really this birth of IllumiNatives from a collective thirst for justice from our Indigenous communities. And so if you could just, for those of us who are not familiar, those of us in the audience who aren't familiar with IllumiNatives, talk a little bit of why the need was there.
Yeah, definitely. I think really the creation story around this work is not just mine or an organization's. I mean, I think it's really an embodiment of just so many of our journeys as Indigenous peoples from all over. And, you know, I think really it came about as I've worked my whole career, you know, fighting for Native American rights, for tribal sovereignty, particularly for our young people. And I think, you know, in doing that work all throughout my life and doing that in partnership with tribal leaders and community leaders all over the country, I think we always just sense this sense of one, either just being invisible, right? And if we were invited into the room, we're usually the only Native person in the room. And then, but also in those interactions out in the world, that we just constantly run into being, you know, reduced to a caricature, a stereotype. You know, I can't tell you how many times myself and so many of us, right, like walk into a doctor's office and talk about symptoms, and we're automatically accused of being an alcoholic, right? And just sort of these really powerful and very toxic narratives about our people that really fuel a lot of bias and racism. And so we did a huge research project, the Reclaiming Native Truth project that Gabrielle mentioned, that really mapped what are the dominant narratives and perceptions that the American public holds and key institutions in this country hold about Native Americans, and why, and where do those come from, and how do they affect the way that Native peoples are treated. And what we found is one of the greatest threats to Native peoples is our invisibility and our erasure. And it's really that erasure and that invisibility is really perpetuated by big systems such as K through 12 education, in which 90% of schools don't teach about Native Americans past 1900, right? So generation after generation of Americans are literally conditioned to think that we're sort of an ancient bygone past, right? We don't exist today. But I think also Hollywood, media, entertainment, pop culture is also a big culprit within that. And our representation in TV and film hovers somewhere between 0 and 0.04%. And what little representation ekes through is either before 1900 representation stories before then, or it's also that really toxic representation, again, that really fuels these sort of tropes about, you know, savages or mystical, magical Indians, or oftentimes are women, if they do show up, they're being brutalized, and oftentimes don't even live to the end of the show or the film, right? So all of that's to say, what we found is that invisibility plus those toxic stereotypes fuel racism. They fuel bias, and those have real world consequences, right, against our people that show up in the courts, how our people are treated in the courts, to Congress, to the way that our children are treated every day in classrooms, to the way, you know, links to the epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women in this country. So really what that research told us is how important representation is, right? And it's not just representation showing up on screen. It matters what's behind the camera. It matters who's elected to office, right? It's really about representation through all levels of society is how we're going to not only dismantle that invisibility and those toxic stereotypes, but really how we're going to advance justice and equity for our people. So with that in mind, that's why we founded IllumiNative, and that's why we really focus on changing the narrative, changing the story for Native peoples, and really building our power through representation.
I have really seen such an explosion recently of Native content, but also over the election season. And, you know, there's just been so much good work, not just coming out of IllumiNative, of course, but other, you know, content creators. And can you speak a little bit to the positive effects of reclaiming Native truth, of actually us being able to have that narrative sovereignty and inform what our image looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is exciting, right? There's definitely an uptick, but I mean, I think there's a couple key points as we think about that, right? Like there have been Native people fighting for our representation in entertainment and media for decades and decades, right? And just sort of important people like, you know, I think about Bird Running Water, for example, and the Sundance Indigenous program, right? And all of that. And you think about, and there's so many more people too that have really been fighting on the front lines of that level of representation. I think you think about Standing Rock, right? Was this moment where I talked about that extreme invisibility that, you know, in which almost 80% of Americans don't know anything about us, and they're not even sure if we exist, many of them. Standing Rock sort of blew a lid off of that back in 2016 and made the world go, wow, Native Americans still exist. And look at, you know, they're fighting for water, their culture, their land. but then really moving into last year, 2020, right? And it's just unfortunate it took the murder of George Floyd, right? And everything in the beginning of a reckoning with systemic racism that I think has begun to shake things, that is opening up an opportunity now, finally, right, for this narrative sovereignty, for Native peoples to really truly author stories. And it's so exciting. There's obviously a definite uptick, and I know we're going to talk about things we're excited about, but it's been a long time coming, right? And there's a lot of work to be done, right? Because we are really, those representation numbers I talked to you about in TV and film, they have literally not moved at all. Like Nielsen just published a report in December, and those have stayed stagnant. So I'm hoping, right, with all the good things that are coming here in 2021 and beyond, we're going to really start to see changes, not only in terms of what we're seeing on TV and film, but what's happening behind the camera as well.
I'm just thinking about how we continue to commit and recommit to making systemic change, because it is systemic, whether it's the justice system or the education system, and really creating some shared understanding of our histories. Because as we know, so many people have no idea about the history of Native people in this country. And so I'm just, in your work with IllumiNatives, I'm also curious about how important it's been for you to work on K through 12 education, and especially the importance for kids to be able to see that positive representation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is so important. I mean, schools are like one of the most powerful vehicles, right? We all go through it. Everybody goes through it. So, but it's also equally challenging, right? To really get school districts to get on board and understanding how the power that they have in shaping young minds and generation after generations of young minds. So it's so deeply important to do that work and to really mandate that schools really teach about Native Americans and allow Native Americans to really, be authors of what is being taught about our respective tribes and communities, right? That's so important. But I think also when we look at this issue around fighting racism, right? Systemic racism, what you talked about, there's such a powerful opportunity here for Hollywood, for media entertainment industry to understand that Hollywood generates 80% of the world's content, right? When we think about that, and that's global, right? And shapes the way what our stories that we tell shape the way that people think about the world and think about communities and people. And there's such a deep responsibility. And I think that this is just this powerful moment in this reckoning to call people in, to really take this introspective moment to understand the power and opportunity that exists to really be a force for good in dismantling white supremacy, dismantling systemic racism, and to really tell stories that really are reflective of our ever rapidly changing and diverse society, of which Indigenous peoples, we play an important role in that. We are still here, we are thriving, we have wonderful stories to tell. And so I just think that there's such an important, powerful opportunity, but it takes a lot of intention in this moment to really, go forward and do that in a good way.
I want to share with the audience that on your website, on the IllumiNative's website, there's a wonderful entertainment guide. And I think it's really important because, just like you said, like, we have a role to play, and as allies, if you are a showrunner or producer, you're just starting out and you're about to create that story, and you have there's some sort of a Native character or storyline. What is the advice that comes from this entertainment guide?
Well, absolutely. And I think, Princess, to turn the tables a little bit on you. I mean, I get the opportunity to talk about representation and why it's important. And I always get asked, what's an example of good representation? And I say, well, there's not very many, but Molly of Denali, and we would be remiss to not mention that, because that's such a model when you talk about, things like the issues that you raise and how resource guides can be important. So just if you could say something.
Yeah, sure. So for those, I up until very recently have been creative producing this series, and I'm also continue to be a writer on the show. And I would say that, growing up, I didn't see anyone that looked like me represented in film and media, and to be able now to see, I'm a mother, I have a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, and for them to be able to see this positive representation has just meant the world. It's like a rejuvenation and a validation of, you know, who they are as Alaska Native boys, young boys, and that's amplified on this really large scale. And we get to share out our Native values, those values of taking care of each other. I mean, I just want to say this is about stop the hate and, you know, our caring for one another. We all come from communities that have survived and thrived because we take care of each other. We look out for one another. There is love there. And our love will always overcome any hate that is out in the world. And we need each other right now, right? Like this is the time for us to really to come together. And I'm excited. I see so many, you know, Indigenous people that are like really out there making amazing content and art, the arts. My gosh, the arts are so important. So I really just want to like get into this conversation of like, what are you excited about? Because I am so excited about what's out there right now.
No, me too. And I just want to say thank you, you know, because it is so true. And just, you know, values, right? And the power to stop hate. We all have it, right? And there's so much power to do that through story. But yes, I'm excited. I mean, the thing that I am like jumping up and down about and can't wait is a week from today, Rutherford Falls premieres on the Peacock, and like super excited. And if you all haven't heard about it, go check out IllumiNative social media. It's everywhere, but you know, there's just tons of articles popping up because they're doing a lot of press. But it's a show co-created by Sierra Ornelas, Mike Schur, comedy god, and Ed Helms. But Sierra is Navajo, and she's the first Native American female showrunner, right? And so, yeah, it's just like she's our like Secretary Deb Haaland in entertainment right now. I kind of tease her about that, and she's like, "Shut up!" But I mean, it's so exciting, this breakthrough moment for a Native woman. It's everything. And the writer's room was 50% Natives. The co-star, Janice Schmeeding, who co-stars, you know, opposite Ed Helms, is Lakota. There's a whole ongoing storyline regarding, you know, a Native American tribe. And it's hilarious. I mean, it hits every mark on representation, but on top of it, it's just funny. Right. And that's why I'm so excited about this vehicle, because it's like doing the right thing can also be fun. It can be entertaining. So super excited about that. I think the other thing that's really close to home right now is that Reservation Dogs, which is co-created by Sterling Harjo and Taika Waititi, that's going to be on FX, is shooting right now here in Oklahoma. So it's all the buzz. And again, you know, all Native, right? I think they had 100% in, you know, Indigenous writers room. So I'm sure that is going to be amazing. And there's so much more I know in development over at, you know, Netflix, Amazon. It feels like every studio now, and I love hearing that, has got things in the works. So it just feels like there's a moment that's finally here where things are really starting to shift. And I think the thing that of all of that is I'm so excited because these are truly Native authored stories, you know, instead of just like, oh, we're going to bring in a Native consultant, right? It's really Native people, Native creators being at the table through every aspect of that storytelling process. And that is just, it's huge, right? You know?
Yes.
What
And
about
just, you know,
what are you excited?
Yeah, same. I'm excited for, you know, all of those things. And I think it's like really important to say, like, you know, the model really has been oftentimes that productions will pull on like a Native advisor or a consultant. But, you know, we are really emphasizing that we have such incredible talent in our Native communities, and we really need to be above the line. If you have, and it's that intention of like, why are you creating something, right? Like, it's like, we have the writers, we have the producers. It's time for us to really be brought in a meaningful way, because we are going to enrich whatever project we come on board to. And so, you know, that to me is like a solid way how to create that systemic change, be a better ally, and really influence. You're influencing hearts and minds. Like the media industry is so incredibly powerful. I remember years and years ago, I studied abroad in China, and when I would say that I was Native American, like people would go, oh,
Yeah.
And that is the impact of the Cowboys and Indians films that still are continuing to be made, right? So I think that in terms of humanizing us, us being able to, again, like reclaim our image because it was taken from us. And really this romanticized image, for years and years and years, I think almost every Native woman I know at some point was called Pocahontas, or had some sort of, derogatory name, because of media, because of film and those images that are out there. And you mentioned, murdered and missing, Indigenous women and girls. And I absolutely feel that ties into that issue. So we need to be humanized. We need to be able to show our humor, our Native humor as well. So again, why I'm so excited. I cannot wait for that premiere next week. There's just like a plethora now of amazing content. And I hope that continues to happen. I think it will across the board. But again, I can't emphasize enough that we really need to be brought in above the line.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think just to sort of underscore what you said, I mean, it came up in our research time and time again, references to different TV shows and films that when we were interviewing focus groups, like all over the country, how much that really shapes the way that people, treat and think about Native Americans. And that goes for other groups, and that's why we have such a deep responsibility, whether we're talking about stories regarding the Black community, Asian Pacific Islanders, Native, down the line, Latinx, like there's such a deep responsibility we have to get it right and ensuring that whatever communities are being represented in that story, they've got to be at the table in a very meaningful way. And I think for some people, maybe there's like some dread and like, oh gosh, the PC police and, but I think that people are hungry for this. And I think that's what we saw. There was just such a seismic shift that happened last year. And I think, we're living in a really polarized environment, but what I see increasingly is that people are craving authenticity. People want to know more. People want to find their way through this. People want to kind of understand. And I think there's just such a power through story to bring people together, to your point, to humanize, and to show all facets. And that it doesn't have to mean that that's a serious story every time, right? Like that's the power of comedy, or just even showing a Native American. I love what Sterling Harjo said on a panel once. They said, what's your ideal representation of a Native person? And he said, a Native person, sitting there drinking a cup of coffee, wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt. Like it's just normal, right? And it becomes normalized. So there's so much opportunity. And, I think the biggest thing is that oftentimes people don't know where to start and where to go. And there's just so many people like IllumiNative, you Princess, like there's so many of us, Bird, Running Water, Sundance, Heather Ray, others, where we're happy to be a bridge. We're happy to point you in the right direction, but to your point, there's a plethora of really talented Native writers, actors, everything. And it's just a question, reach out, and there's a lot of us that are willing to help connect.
Masito, thank you so much, Crystal. I'm also just thinking about how often our education will pull from media, will pull from film or television. And so, again, the more that we are able to have that narrative sovereignty and share out our values, it connects all generations to truth. It connects all generations to our values, which again, it's like we're at such a pivotal point in history with climate change and really, what can we do in terms of putting our heart and intentions and mindset to solutions? And I'm so excited. We have so many Native women at Department of Interior that are like up, working in this government right now. And we have so many people in Hollywood and all these arenas of education and philanthropy, et cetera. And there's just so many more people out in the world doing good. And we just don't hear about it as much in the media, But again, we are so much more powerful. And as we continue to be better allies and educate ourselves, make room for mistakes though, because we make mistakes, right? But give each other grace and really like, let's hold hands through this. And so again, I am so grateful that SAG-AFTRA invited us to have this conversation, that we are all, you know, in dialogue with one another. Hi, Gabrielle and Crystal, for, you know, making the time for this. And we are going to continue, y'all, to be a collective, to work together to stop the hate. And I'm just so grateful. Masik Cho.
Yes, thank you.
So beautiful. Thank you both, really, Princess and Crystal. Beautiful solutions, working through things, making a difference. Really appreciate everything, like your contributions on behalf of the Native American and Indigenous community, and especially, I have to say, sharing with us the strategy setting, which is the core of what we're aiming to accomplish during the Stop the Hate Week. So this was really wonderful. So we're going to see everybody back here at 1:30 Pacific time and 4:30 Eastern with our keynote, moving from conversation to action. That's the whole idea of what we're doing with the female quotients, Shelley Zalis. So see you at 1:30, 4:30. Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.